The desert remembers everything, every footstep, every tear, every cry that pierces the silence between earth and heaven. In the scorching wasteland between promise and abandonment, a boy lies dying. His mother turns away, unable to watch. The sun burns mercilessly overhead. No water, no hope, only the sound of labored breathing and a mother's broken sobs echoing across endless dunes. But in that moment of absolute despair, something shifts in the heavens. A voice breaks through the deadly silence. Not to the mother, not to the father who sent them away, to the boy himself. God heard. This is not just a story of survival. This is the untold chronicle of Ishmael, the forgotten son whose name means God hears. While history remembers the chosen child of promise, it has overlooked the profound mystery of the one who was cast out yet never abandoned, the one who heard the voice of the Almighty in humanity's darkest hour. His story spans millennia, from the tents of Abraham to the foundations of nations, from a cry in the wilderness to the prayers of millions, from rejection to redemption, from exile to eternal legacy. You think you know this story. You think you understand who was chosen and who was forgotten. But what if everything you believed about divine favor and human worth was about to be turned upside down? What if the greatest revelation came not to the son of promise, but to the son of sorrow? What if God's most profound message was whispered not in palace halls, but in the desolate places where hope goes to die? The desert remembers, and today it speaks. The air hung thick with tension in Abraham's camp that morning. Servants moved with hushed urgency, their eyes avoiding the heated conversations that had become commonplace. The smell of burning incense mixed with the dust kicked up by restless animals, creating an atmosphere heavy with unspoken conflict. Sarah, her paced outside tent, her weathered hands clenched at her sides. At 65, she carried the weight of decades of barren hopes, each passing month another reminder of promises unfulfilled. The laughter had long since died in her eyes, replaced by a hardness that even Abraham's tender words could not soften. 11 years, she whispered to herself, the words bitter on her tongue. 11 years since we left Ur, and still my womb remains closed. Across the camp, Hagar ground grain with mechanical precision, her young Egyptian hands moving in rhythm born of endless repetition. She had been Sarah's gift from Pharaoh's house, a symbol of their brief sojourn in Egypt. Now she served as a constant reminder of both foreign lands and unfulfilled dreams. The girl was beautiful in the way that youth makes everything beautiful. Dark eyes that still held wonder, skin unmarked by the harsh desert sun, movements that spoke of a body unbroken by disappointment. Sarah watched her sometimes, feeling something twist in her chest that she dare not name. Abraham sat in the shade of a massive oak tree, his gaze distant as he studied the horizon. The promise echoed in his mind daily, as clear as the day God first spoke it. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. But where were the descendants numerous as the stars? Where was the son who would carry his name into the future? The camp itself told the story of their prosperity and their pain. Hundreds of servants, thousands of animals, tents that stretched across the landscape like a small city. God had blessed them with wealth beyond measure, yet the one thing they desired most remained just beyond their reach. Hagar moved through this world of privilege and pain with the careful grace of one who understood her place. She was neither family nor stranger, neither free nor truly enslaved. She existed in the spaces between, watching the drama of her masters unfold while remaining carefully invisible. The servants whispered sometimes when they thought no one could hear. About Sarah's tears in the night, about Abraham's long walks alone in the desert, about the growing desperation that seemed to settle over the camp like dust after a sandstorm. Perhaps, Sarah had suggested one evening, her voice carefully controlled, perhaps the Lord intends for the promise to be fulfilled through another. Abraham had looked up, fire his eyes from the questioning. Hagar is young, Sarah continued, the words coming out in a rush. She could bear you a son. The child would be yours, and through custom, mine as well. The weight of that conversation still hung between them. Ancient customs permitted such arrangements, but they also carried dangers that wise hearts recognized. Sarah told herself it was practical. Abraham told himself it was faithful. Neither acknowledged the seeds of future sorrow they were planting. Hagar, when approached, had no choice but to consent. She was property after all, even if kindly treated property. But something in her eyes suggested she understood more than she let on. Perhaps she sensed the undercurrents of desperation and rivalry that would soon engulf them all. The night before the arrangement was to be consummated, Hagar lay on her simple mat and stared up at the stars. She thought of her homeland, of the great river Nile and the temples of her childhood. She thought of gods who spoke through priests and pharaohs, of a world where divine will was interpreted by intermediaries. She had no way of knowing that the God of Abraham spoke differently, that his voice could reach the forgotten and the cast aside, that even now he was preparing to reveal himself in ways that would shatter every assumption about who deserved to hear heaven's secrets. Abraham, too, spent that night in contemplation. He walked among his flocks, listening to the gentle sounds of animals at rest, breathing in the familiar scent of desert wind and distant cooking fires. The stars above seemed closer, and than usual he remembered that first promise. Descendants as numerous as those points of light. But doubt gnawed at him. Was he forcing God's hand? Was he taking matters into his own control rather than waiting for divine timing? The questions churned in his mind like sand in a windstorm, offering no clear answers. Sarah, alone in her tent, pressed her face into her hands and tried to pray. But the words felt hollow, mechanical. How many times had she begged for a child? How many nights had she pleaded with the Almighty to open her womb? The silence from heaven felt heavier than the desert heat. None of them could foresee what was coming. None of them understood that they were about to set in motion events that would ripple across centuries, shaping the destiny of nations yet unborn. They saw only their immediate pain, their immediate needs, their immediate solutions. The desert wind picked up that night, carrying with it the scent of change. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out, its voice piercing the darkness with a sound both mournful and hopeful. In the morning, their world would begin to shift. Ancient customs would be observed, new life would be conceived, and in the space between human desperation and divine purpose, a story would begin that would echo through eternity. But first, they slept, each dreaming their own dreams, each carrying their own hopes and fears into the realm of night. None of them knowing that tomorrow would mark the beginning of something far greater and more complex than any of them could imagine. The desert remembers every moment of human struggle, every prayer whispered into the darkness, every tear shed in the silence between sunset and dawn. And in that memory it holds the beginning of a story that would prove God's voice reaches furthest in the moments when hope seems most distant. The morning came with unusual stillness, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation of what was to unfold. Hagar woke before dawn, as was her custom, but something felt different in the quality of silence that surrounded her. The camp still slept, even the early rising servants lost in dreams, leaving her alone with thoughts that had kept her restless through the night. She moved through her morning duties with mechanical precision, but her mind wandered to memories of a life that felt increasingly distant. Egypt seemed like another world now, with its great river and towering monuments, its bustling markets and sacred temples. She remembered being a child in Pharaoh's household, watching the priests perform their elaborate rituals, seeing gods who spoke only through intermediaries and required complex ceremonies to approach. Here in Abraham's camp, she had learned of a different kind of deity, one who walked with men in the cool of evening, one who spoke directly without temples or priests as barriers. It should have been comforting, this accessible God. Instead, it left her feeling exposed, uncertain of her place in a divine order she didn't fully understand. Abraham emerged from his tent earlier than usual, his face bearing the weight of sleepless contemplation. He had wrestled with his decision through the long night hours, measuring human wisdom against divine patience, practical solutions against faith in the impossible. At 75, he had learned that some burdens grow heavier with time rather than lighter. He found Hagar preparing the morning meal, her movements graceful despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. When their eyes met, both looked away quickly, neither ready to acknowledge the significance of what lay ahead. The arrangement had been discussed, agreed upon, blessed by custom and necessity. Yet something in the morning light made it feel surreal, as if they were actors in a story written by hands other than their own. Sarah remained in her tent longer than usual, her own struggle evident in the sounds of restless movement that filtered through the fabric walls. She had proposed this solution, had argued for its wisdom, had convinced herself it was God's intended path. But now, faced with its reality, she felt a strange hollowness in her chest, as if something essential had been carved away in the night. The servant sensed the undercurrents without understanding their source. Conversations were more hushed, glances more careful, movements more deliberate. The camp had seen many changes over the years, but this felt different. This felt like a threshold being crossed, a point beyond which return would be impossible. When Abraham finally approached Hagar that afternoon, his words were gentle but formal. "The Lord has closed Sarah's womb," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of disappointment. "Perhaps through you his promise might find fulfillment." Hagar nodded, her training in submission overriding the questions that burned in her throat. She wanted to ask about love, about choice, about what would happen to any child born of this union. But servants did not ask such questions of their masters, no matter how kindly those masters treated them. That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them shared a meal that tasted of obligation rather than nourishment. Sarah spoke little, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the camp. Abraham made careful conversation about flocks and weather, avoiding the elephant that sat heavy among them. Hagar served in silence, her movements careful and deliberate. Later, alone in the tent that had been prepared for the occasion, Hagar stared up at the woven ceiling and tried to make sense of her circumstances. She was about to become mother to the child of promise, yet she felt more like an instrument than a person. Her body would house the future, but what of her heart? What of her dreams? She thought of the other servants, women who had borne children to their masters throughout history. Some found joy in motherhood despite the circumstances. Others discovered that bringing forth life in such conditions only amplified their sense of displacement. Which would she become? Abraham, in his own tent, knelt on the hard ground and lifted his face toward heaven. "Lord," he whispered, "I have waited so long for your promise to unfold. If this is your way, give me wisdom, give me strength. Help me to be faithful to you and just to those you have placed in my care." Selma. The silence that followed felt different from the empty quiet he had grown accustomed to. This silence seemed pregnant with possibility, heavy with the sense that divine wheels were turning, that purposes beyond human understanding were being set in motion. Sarah lay on her bed staring into the darkness and felt tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes. Tomorrow another woman would lie with her husband. Another woman would potentially carry the child she had prayed for through countless years bar. The logic was sound, the custom acceptable, the necessity clear. But her heart felt as if it were being torn in pieces. None of them understood that they stood on the edge of a mystery greater than their individual pain. None of them could see that their very human struggles were about to intersect with divine purpose in ways that would reshape their understanding of how God works in the world. The desert wind whispered through the camp that night, carrying with it the scent of distant places and the promise of change. In the darkness, small creatures stirred, beginning their nightly hunt for survival. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggle, yet somehow part of a larger story that encompassed both cosmic grandeur and individual tears. When morning came, it would bring with it the fulfillment of their plan. But it would also begin a journey none of them had anticipated. One that would test every assumption they held about divine favor, human worth, and the mysterious ways in which heaven intersects with earth. The boy who would be born of this union would carry a name that meant God hears. But first, in the quiet hours before dawn, three people wrestled with their own very human hearts, each trying to align their will with what they believed to be the will of the Almighty. None understanding of them, yet how profoundly their lives were about to change. The seasons turned, and with them came subtle changes that only the most observant eyes could detect. Hagar's body began to transform in ways that spoke of new life taking root, but the changes ran deeper than flesh and blood. Something in her bearing had shifted, a quiet confidence that hadn't existed before, as if she carried within herself not just a child, but a secret knowledge that set her apart. The camp noticed. Servants who had once looked past her now watched her movements with curious eyes. The way she carried herself had changed, her head held slightly higher, her steps more deliberate. It wasn't arrogance exactly, but rather the dignity of one who suddenly understood her own significance in a story larger than herself. Sarah felt the shift like a physical weight pressing against her chest. Each morning brought fresh evidence of what she herself had orchestrated but now found increasingly difficult to bear. The sight of Hagar's changing silhouette was a daily reminder of her own barrenness, a living contradiction to every prayer she had whispered in the darkness. The tension manifested in small ways at first, a sharper tone when giving instructions, a longer pause before responding to Hagar's respectful greetings. The careful distance that began to grow between women who had once shared the intimate rhythms of domestic life. Sarah herself, it was natural toll, temporary, a necessary adjustment to new circumstances. But deep in her heart, she recognized the poison of envy taking root. Abraham found himself caught between worlds, torn between joy at the prospect of fatherhood and concern for the women whose lives had become increasingly complicated by his presence. He watched Sarah's growing coldness with the helpless pain of a man who loved deeply but could not heal the wounds that love itself had opened. He observed Hagar's transformation with wonder tinged by apprehension, uncertain of what this new dynamic would mean for all of them. The child in Hagar's womb seemed to carry with it an energy that affected everything around it. Animals grew restless without apparent cause. Servants reported strange dreams filled with symbols they couldn't interpret. The very air around the camp seemed charged with possibility, as if the normal boundaries between earth and heaven had grown thin. Hagar herself experienced phenomena she dared not share with others. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she felt as though invisible hands rested gently on her expanding belly. She heard whispers that might have been wind but carried the cadence of words in a language she almost understood. There were moments when the desert seemed to shimmer with presence, when the ordinary landscape transformed into something sacred and alive. She began to dream with an intensity that left her breathless upon waking. Visions of vast wildernesses where water sprang from barren ground, images of a child who grew strong and free beneath endless skies, prophetic glimpses of tents scattered across horizons like stars fallen to earth. The dreams felt more real than waking life, more true than the daily routines that structured her existence. One evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of fire, Hagar walked alone to the edge of the camp. The practice had become a ritual, these solitary moments when she could breathe freely away from the increasingly strained atmosphere of fens. As she stood watching the light fade from the heavens, she felt a stirring within her womb that was different from the usual movements of the child. This was not mere physical sensation, but something that seemed to communicate directly with her spirit. A presence that spoke without words, a knowledge that entered her mind without explanation. For the first time in her life, she understood with absolute clarity that she was not alone. that forces beyond human comprehension were intimately aware of her circumstances and deeply concerned with her welfare. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with a peace she had never known, a sense of being held and protected that transcended her earthly circumstances. Whatever hardships lay ahead, whatever conflicts arose between her and those who owned her body, she was not abandoned. She was seen, she was known, she was valued by powers that surpassed human understanding. But with this comfort came also a growing awareness of the magnitude of what was unfolding. The child she carried was not merely the solution to one family's longing for an heir. He was part of a story that stretched beyond the boundaries of their camp, beyond the lifetime of any individual, beyond the immediate concerns that consumed their daily existence. That night, as she lay on her sleeping mat, Hagar placed both hands on her belly and spoke softly to the life within. "Little one," she whispered, "I don't know what lies ahead for us, but I sense that you are destined for something far greater than any of us can imagine. Whatever comes, know that you are wanted. Know that you are precious. Know that heaven itself watches over you." The child seemed to respond to her words, moving with what felt like recognition and acceptance. In that moment, Hagar experienced a connection that transcended the biological bond between mother and unborn child. She felt as though she was communing with a soul that carried within itself the potential to reshape the world. Miles away in his own tent, Abraham knelt in prayer and felt an unusual warmth in the air around him. The words he spoke seemed to echo with more resonance than usual, as if the space between earth and heaven had somehow contracted. When he finished his prayers, he remained motionless for long minutes, sensing that he stood on the threshold of something momentous but not yet understanding its nature. Sarah, alone with her thoughts, found herself drawn to her tent's opening to gaze out at the star-filled sky. The constellations seemed brighter than usual, more alive, as if they pulsed with significance she couldn't decode. For the first time in months, she felt a stirring of something beyond bitterness and disappointment. Not hope exactly, but a recognition that forces larger than her personal pain were at work in their midst. The desert wind carried strange music that night, melodies that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than from any human instrument. Those who heard it remembered it in their dreams, waking with fragments of songs they couldn't quite recall but that left them feeling as though they had been touched by something eternal. In the morning, the camp would resume its normal rhythms, but nothing would truly be the same. The whispers of the unknown had grown louder. The boundaries between ordinary existence and divine mystery had grown thinner, and all of them had begun to sense that they were participants in a drama whose full significance would only be revealed in time. The child in Hagar's womb continued to grow, carrying within his developing form not just the genetic heritage of his earthly father, but the destiny of nations yet unborn. And though none of them could yet understand the full implications of what was unfolding, each felt in their own way that they had become part of something that would echo through the corridors of eternity. The morning arrived with an unusual quality of light, as if the sun itself recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. Hagar woke with a restlessness that had been building for days, an inner urgency that seemed to pull her towards something she couldn't name. The camp stirred around her with its familiar rhythms, but she felt disconnected from its routine, as if she existed in a space between worlds. Sarah's behavior had grown increasingly sharp in recent weeks, her words carrying edges that cut deeper than their surface meaning. The pregnancy that had once seemed like a solution now felt like a burden that weighed down every interaction between them. Small tasks became occasions for tension. Simple conversations transformed into battlegrounds of unspoken resentment. That morning, the conflict finally erupted into open hostility. It began with something trivial, a disagreement over the preparation of bread. But the real issue lay far beneath such mundane concerns. Sarah's voice rose with months of accumulated frustration. Her words aimed not just at Hagar's actions, but at her very presence, her presumption, her obvious satisfaction in carrying the child that Sarah herself could not conceive. "You think you're better than me now." Sarah's words came like arrows, sharp and precisely aimed. "You walk around this camp as if you're the mistress instead of the servant. You forget your place, forget who owns you, forget that the child you carry exists only because of my generosity." Hagar stood silent under the verbal assault, her hands instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. The child within seemed to sense the hostility in the air, moving restlessly as if trying to escape the harsh words that surrounded them. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a dignity that only inflamed Sarah's anger further. "I have forgotten nothing, my lady. But neither can I forget that this child moves within me, that he is part of my flesh as well as my master's. I did not ask for this burden, but I will bear it with honor." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Sarah's response came swift and merciless. The blows were not physical, but worse, a systematic destruction of Hagar's position in the camp, a reduction of her status to something less than human, a reminder that she existed solely at the pleasure of those who owned her. Unable to bear more, Hagar fled. She ran from the camp without direction or plan, driven by pain and desperation into the trackless wilderness that stretched beyond the boundaries of Abraham's domain. The desert received her without judgment, its silence a relief after the harsh words that had driven her from the only home she knew. Hours passed as she wandered deeper into the wasteland, her feet carrying her along paths that existed more in her heart than on the ground. The sun climbed higher, its heat becoming oppressive, but she continued walking as if movement itself could distance her from the pain that pursued her. When exhaustion finally forced her to stop, she found herself beside a spring that seemed to appear from nowhere, its water clear and cool in the midst of the barren landscape. She collapsed beside the water, her body trembling from exertion and emotion. For the first time since leaving the camp, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She was alone in the wilderness, pregnant and vulnerable, with no resources except the clothes on her back. Behind her lay a home that had become unbearable. Ahead stretched only uncertainty and danger. As she knelt by the spring, cupping the precious water in her hands, something shifted in the quality of air around her. The ordinary sounds of the desert, the whisper of wind through stone and the distant cry of birds, seemed to fade into profound silence. The very light appeared to change, becoming somehow more luminous while remaining gentle enough not to blind her. Then came the voice. It didn't arrive as sound in the conventional sense, but rather as a presence that communicated directly with her spirit. The words formed in her mind with themselves perfect clarity, carrying with them a weight of authority that made her certain she was not imagining what she experienced. Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? The question penetrated to the core of her being, asking not just about her physical journey, but about the deeper currents of her life, her identity, her destiny. She found herself answering with an honesty that surprised her, speaking to this invisible presence as she had never spoken to any earthly authority. "I am running away from my mistress Sarah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I cannot bear her hatred, her cruelty, the way she looks at me as if I were less than human." The presence seemed to consider her words, and when it spoke again, the voice carried layers of meaning that her mind could barely grasp. What came was not the comfort she expected, but a command that challenged everything she thought she understood about her situation. "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The words struck her like physical blows. Return to Sarah? Submit to the woman who had driven her into the wilderness with harsh words and harsher treatment? Every instinct in her body recoiled from the suggestion. Every fiber of her being cried out against such apparent injustice. But before she could voice her protest, the voice continued, and what followed transformed her understanding of everything that had transpired. "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." The promise hit her with the force of revelation. This child she carried, conceived in desperation and born into conflict, was destined for something far beyond the petty struggles of Abraham's camp. Through him would come not just one family, but entire nations. Peoples as numerous as the stars that wheeled overhead in their nightly dance. Then came words that would echo through the centuries, a prophecy that would shape the destiny of countless generations yet unborn. "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction." Ishmael. God hears. The name fell into her consciousness like a seed planted in fertile ground, carrying within it the promise of growth beyond anything she could imagine. Her son would bear a name that testified to divine attention, to heavenly concern for the forgotten and the cast aside. But the prophecy was not finished. The voice continued, painting a picture of her son's future that was both glorious and troubling. "He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." The words carried complexity that her mind struggled to process. Freedom and conflict, independence and isolation, strength and struggle, all woven together in a destiny that promised greatness, but warned of the price such greatness would demand. As the voice faded, leaving her alone beside the spring, Hagar felt transformed in ways that went beyond physical or emotional change. She had encountered something that existed beyond human understanding, had been touched by a presence that saw her not as property or servant, but as a person of infinite worth, a participant in a story that stretched across generations. She rose from beside the spring with new purpose. her steps no longer those of a fleeing servant but of a woman who carried within herself both a divine promise and a sacred responsibility. The journey back to Abraham's camp would not be easy, but she now understood that it was necessary, part of a larger plan that required her submission to temporary hardship in service of eternal purposes. The desert around her seemed different as she began her return journey, alive with significance she had never noticed before. Each stone and plant appeared to pulse with meaning. Each shift in the wind carried messages she almost understood. She walked not as owned by invisible alone, but as one accompanied forces that watched and guided and protected. When she finally saw the familiar tents rising from the horizon, her heart no longer raced with fear but beat with the steady rhythm of acceptance. Whatever awaited her there, she would face it knowing that she carried within herself not just a child, but a destiny that would outlast the temporary conflicts of mortal existence. The encounter by the spring had changed everything, transforming her from a runaway servant into a bearer of divine promise, from a victim of human cruelty into a participant in cosmic purpose. She had heard the voice of the Eternal, and that voice had called her son by name before he was born. The return journey stretched before her like a path between two worlds. Each step carried Hagar further from the spring where heaven had touched earth, yet closer to a reality that now seemed almost surreal in its ordinariness. The voice still echoed in her mind, its words reshaping everything she thought she understood about her purpose, her value, her destiny. The desert had become a different place entirely. Where once she saw only barren wasteland, she now perceived a landscape alive with meaning. Every rock formation seemed to whisper of permanence beyond human understanding. Every shift in the wind carried messages of purposes larger than individual comfort. The very ground beneath her feet felt sacred, as if she walked on holy ground that extended far beyond any temple built by human hands. But with divine revelation came crushing responsibility. The weight of what she carried was no longer simply biological, the natural burden of pregnancy that every woman understood. Now she bore within her body a destiny that would reshape nations, a promise that stretched across centuries, a name that testified to God's attention to the forgotten corners of human experience. Ishmael. The word formed on her lips like a prayer, a declaration, a burden too heavy for mortal shoulders to carry. God hears. But what did it mean to be the mother of one whom heaven had marked before birth? What did it require of a woman who had been nothing more than property in the eyes of those around her? The questions multiplied with each mile she traveled. How could she raise a child destined for greatness while living as a servant in another woman's household? How could she nurture the wild freedom that the divine voice had promised while existing within the constraints of Abraham's camp? How could she prepare Ishmael for a destiny that defied every social convention she had ever known? The sun moved across the sky as she walked, its heat a constant reminder of the harsh realities that awaited her return. Sarah's anger had not diminished in her absence. If anything, Hagar's flight would have been interpreted as the ultimate act of defiance, a rejection of the order that held their world together. There would be consequences, punishments, a systematic effort to break whatever spirit had driven her to rebel. Yet the voice had been clear. return, and submit. The command challenged everything within her that cried out for justice, for recognition, for basic human dignity. How could a God who heard her affliction ask her to walk willingly back into the source of that suffering? How could divine love require her to place herself once again under the authority of one who had shown her nothing but cruelty? As the familiar landscape of Abraham's territory came into view, Hagar felt the full weight of what submission would mean. It was not mere obedience to human authority, though that was part of it. It was surrender to a divine plan that she could not fully comprehend, trust in purposes that extended far beyond her own comfort or safety. It was faith in a promise that would not be fulfilled in her lifetime, but through generations yet unborn. The camp appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. From a distance, everything looked exactly as she had left it. The same arrangement of tents, the same patterns of smoke rising from cooking fires, the same rhythm of life that had defined her existence for so many years. But she was no longer the same woman who had fled in desperation and rage. Abraham was the first to see her approach. He had been standing at the edge of the camp, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he had been waiting for her return. The relief in his eyes was unmistakable, but so was the concern. Her disappearance had created ripples of consequence that extended beyond her personal conflict with Sarah. The camp had been thrown into disorder, questions had been raised about his leadership, doubts had crept into conversations about God's favor and divine guidance. When she drew near enough for conversation, Abraham's voice carried layers of emotion that his careful words could not entirely conceal. "Hagar," he said, her name sounding different in his mouth, weighted with new significance. "We feared we had lost you to the wilderness. Sarah has been troubled by your absence." The mention of Sarah's concern struck Hagar as almost absurd, given the circumstances of her departure. But she sensed that Abraham spoke not of remorse but of the practical difficulties her flight had created. In the complex social structure of their camp, her rebellion had threatened more than just domestic harmony. It had raised questions about authority, stability, and the divine favor that legitimized Abraham's leadership. "I have returned, my lord," she replied, her voice carrying a composure that seemed to surprise him. "I am ready to resume my duties." But even as she spoke the words of submission, Hagar felt the child within her womb stir with unusual intensity, as if Ishmael himself recognized the significance of this moment. The movement reminded her that she did not return alone, that the promise she carried would not be silenced by human attempts to diminish its importance. That evening, as she knelt beside Sarah to assist with the evening meal, the tension between them crackled like electricity in the dry desert air. Sarah's eyes held a mixture of triumph and suspicion, satisfaction at Hagar's return combined with wariness about what might have changed during her absence. The conversation that passed between them was carefully neutral, each word chosen to avoid reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. But Hagar found that the encounter by the spring had changed something fundamental in how she experienced Sarah's hostility. The harsh words still stung, the deliberate slights still wounded, but they no longer had the power to define her sense of worth. She had heard a voice that spoke of her value in terms that no humanish authority could demand, received promises that no earthly power could revoke. The nights were the hardest. Alone with her thoughts, removed from the distractions of daily labor, she wrestled with the implications of her new knowledge. The child she carried would be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. What did such a destiny mean for a mother who loved her unborn son? How could she prepare him for a life defined by conflict and independence when she herself lived in submission and constraint? Sleep brought dreams that were more vivid than waking life. Visions of a boy growing strong and free beneath endless skies. Learning the ways of the desert from teachers who valued strength over compliance saw him becoming. She a master archer, his arrows finding their mark with supernatural precision. She watched him gather followers who respected his independence more than they feared conventional authority. But the dreams also showed her the cost of such a destiny. Isolation that came with refusing to bend to others' expectations, conflict that arose from challenging established orders. The loneliness that accompanied those who walked paths others feared to tread. Her heart ached for the struggles her son would face, even as it swelled with pride at the strength he would demonstrate. Abraham, observing her during these weeks, seemed to sense that something had changed during her time in the wilderness. He watched her with new attention, noting the way she carried herself, the quality of her silence, the depth that seemed to have entered her gaze. When he spoke to her, his tone carried a respect that had been absent before, as if he recognized that she had become something more than the servant he had known. The other women in the camp noticed the change as well. Servants who had once looked past her now studied her movements with curiosity. There was something in her bearing that suggested she possessed knowledge they lacked, had experienced something that set her apart from their shared circumstances. They whispered among themselves, wondering what had happened during her flight, sensing that her return marked more than just the end of a domestic crisis. As her pregnancy advanced, the child's movements grew stronger and more frequent, as if Ishmael sensed the significance of the world he was preparing to enter. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, Hagar would place her hands on her swollen belly and speak softly to the life within. "My son," she would whisper, "you carry within yourself the promise of nations. You will face trials I cannot imagine, walk paths I have never seen, become something greater than any of us can understand. But know this, always know this, you are heard by the one who matters most. Your very name declares that heaven itself pays attention to your existence." The burden of raising such a child weighed heavily on her heart. How could she, a servant with no authority over her own life, prepare him for a destiny that defied every convention of their world? How could she teach him to be wild and free while living under the control of those who would seek to tame and constrain him? Yet the voice by the spring had promised not just difficulty but multiplication beyond counting. Through this boy who would know conflict and independence in equal measure would come peoples as numerous as the stars. The promise stretched beyond anything her mind could grasp, extending into futures she would never see but had helped to create. The impossible mission was clear. Raise a son destined for greatness while living in circumstances designed to diminish that greatness at every turn. Nurture independence while teaching submission. Prepare him for a wild freedom while existing within the constraints of servitude. But she would do it, because the voice that had spoken by the spring had made one thing absolutely clear. She was not alone in this task. The God who hears would watch over both mother and child, guiding them through trials that would forge the strength necessary for the destiny that awaited. The child came into the world on a night when the stars seemed unusually bright, as if heaven itself celebrated this birth that would reshape the future of nations. Hagar's labor was long and difficult, but when she first held Ishmael in her arms, she felt the weight of divine promise made flesh, the mysterious convergence of human love and cosmic purpose. Abraham's joy was unmistakable as he cradled his firstborn son. At 86 years of age, he had waited decades for this moment, and the reality of fatherhood transformed his weathered features with wonder. He spoke the name aloud with reverence. Ishmael, letting the syllables roll off his tongue like a prayer. God hears. In this tiny, vulnerable infant, he saw the beginning of the fulfillment of promises that had sustained him through years of waiting. But even in those first moments of celebration, the complexities that would define Ishmael's childhood were already evident. Sarah maintained a careful distance, her smiles forced and her congratulations hollow. She had orchestrated this birth, yet now that it was accomplished, she struggled with emotions she could not name or acknowledge. The child was legally hers according to custom, but every instinct told her he belonged to another woman in ways that law could not alter. The camp celebrated appropriately, with feasts and songs that acknowledged the significance of Abraham's heir. Servants who had watched the patriarch age without offspring now witnessed the miracle of new life in his household. Animals were sacrificed, wine was shared, and prayers of thanksgiving rose like incense toward the desert sky. For that brief time it seemed as though the tensions that had marked Ishmael's conception might be forgotten in the joy of his arrival. But childhood has a way of revealing truths that adults prefer to keep hidden. And Ishmael's early years became a study in the complex dynamics of a household divided against itself. He was simultaneously the most important person in the camp and the least secure, the heir to vast promises and the son of a servant, beloved by his father and tolerated by the woman who claimed legal authority over his existence. Abraham delighted in his son with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He carried Ishmael through the camp, showing him the flocks and herds that would one day be his inheritance. He taught him to identify the stars that wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, pointing out constellations while whispering stories of the God who had made promises too wonderful to fully comprehend. In Abraham's eyes, every milestone of Ishmael's development was evidence of divine favor, proof that heaven had not forgotten the covenant made years before. Hagar watched her son grow with a mixture of fierce pride and growing apprehension. The boy displayed the wild spirit that the divine voice had prophesied, a restless energy that seemed barely contained by the structures of civilized life. He ran when others walked, climbed when others sat still, questioned when others accepted without thought. There was something untamable about him, a quality that both thrilled and worried his mother. But it was this very wildness that increasingly disturbed Sarah. She observed Ishmael's development with eyes sharpened by years of resentment and fear, noting every display of independence as evidence of future rebellion, every moment of spirited play as proof of his unsuitability for the role of heir. The boy's laughter seemed too loud, his curiosity too bold, his confidence too pronounced for one who should remember his place in the household hierarchy. The first serious confrontation came when Ishmael was still a small child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old. He had been playing with some of the servant children, leading them in a game that involved mock battles and elaborate adventures. To the other children it was innocent fun, but Sarah saw something more troubling. The natural authority that Ishmael exercised over his peers, the way they looked to him for leadership and direction. He thinks he's already master of this camp, she complained to Abraham that evening, her voice tight with frustration. He orders the other children around as if he were born to command instead of serve. You're spoiling him, filling his head with ideas above his station. Abraham's response was gentle but firm. He is my son, Sarah, my firstborn. These are not ideas above his station, but recognition of what God has promised him. The conversation revealed the fundamental divide that would shape Ishmael's childhood. Abraham saw in the boy the fulfillment of divine promises, evidence of God's faithfulness, and the beginning of the great nation that had been foretold. Sarah saw a threat to the order she had spent years trying to establish, a reminder of her own failure wrapped in the form of a child who belonged to another woman. As Ishmael grew older, these conflicts intensified rather than resolved. The boy seemed almost instinctively to understand the tensions that surrounded his existence, responding with a defiance that was both natural and calculated. When Sarah attempted to correct his behavior, he would look to his mother for guidance, creating a triangle of authority that undermined the household's stability. When Abraham praised his accomplishments, Ishmael would glance at Sarah with a mixture of challenge and uncertainty, testing the boundaries of her tolerance. The servants watched these dynamics with fascination and growing concern. They understood that Ishmael's position in the household was more precarious than his father's love might suggest, that Sarah's hostility represented a real threat to his future security. Some aligned themselves quietly with Hagar and her son, recognizing that the winds of power might shift in unexpected directions. Others maintained careful neutrality, understanding that survival in such circumstances required avoiding entanglement in conflicts beyond their control. Hagar found herself caught between impossible demands. Abraham expected her to raise Ishmael with the confidence appropriate to an heir, to nurture the qualities that would prepare him for leadership and greatness. Sarah demanded submission and humility, insisting that both mother and son remember their true status in the household hierarchy. The boy himself seemed to thrive on the tension, as if conflict was the natural element in which his spirit flourished. The resistance that characterized this period was not merely external but internal as well. Ishmael struggled to understand his own identity. caught between the destiny his mother whispered about in private moments and the daily reality of life as the son of a servant. He loved his father deeply, but sensed the pain his very existence caused the woman who claimed authority over his life. He felt the call of wild spaces beyond the camp's boundaries, but was constrained by the obligations of domestic existence. Abraham, too, faced internal resistance as he tried to balance his roles as husband and father. His love for Ishmael was genuine and profound, but it existed within the context of a marriage that grew more strained with each passing year. Every moment of joy he shared with his son created corresponding pain in his relationship with Sarah. Every expression of pride in Ishmael's development deepened her sense of resentment. The Aegean and of resistance reached its climax when Ishmael was approaching adolescence, old enough to understand the full complexity of his situation but not yet mature enough to navigate it with wisdom. A series of incidents, each minor in itself but collectively significant, brought the underlying tensions to a breaking point. Ishmael's natural leadership among the camp's youth began to challenge established hierarchies. His questions about inheritance and authority threatened conversations adults preferred to avoid. His resemblance to Abraham became more pronounced, a daily reminder of genetic connections that transcended legal arrangements. Sarah's patience, already worn thin by years of accumulated grievances, finally shattered entirely. The confrontation that followed was not about any single incident, but about the fundamental question of Ishmael's place in Abraham's household and his claim to the inheritance that had been promised to Abraham's descendants. "This cannot continue," she declared to Abraham with finality that brooked no negotiation. "The boy grows more rebellious each day, more convinced of his own importance. He challenges my authority in front of the servants, questions decisions that are not his to make. If this continues, he will destroy the order of our household entirely." Mother, Abraham listened with the weariness of a man who had fought this battle too many times before. But Sarah was not finished. Her next words carried the weight of ultimatum, the force of a decision that would reshape all their lives. The age of resistance had run its course, but its end would bring not resolution but transformation. Not peace, but a new kind of struggle that would test every relationship in ways none of them could anticipate. The boy who had learned to thrive in conflict was about to discover that some battles could only be won through surrender. Some victories could only be achieved through loss. The desert wind that night carried the scent of change, the promise of journeys that would take them all far from the familiar tensions of Abraham's camp into territories where the rules that had governed their lives would no longer apply. The decision came like a blade through the heart of everything Ishmael had ever known. Sarah's words, delivered with the cold precision of judgment, severed connections that had taken 13 years to build. "Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." Isaac. The name fell into their world like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would reshape every relationship, every assumption, every dream they had carefully constructed. The miracle child, born to Sarah in her old age, had arrived not as a blessing that expanded their family, but as a force that would tear it apart. Abraham aged a decade in the moment he heard those words. The joy that had illuminated his features when Isaac first drew breath now warred with an anguish so profound it seemed to hollow out his very soul. For 13 years Ishmael had been his only son, the child of promise, the heir who carried his hopes into an uncertain future. Now he faced a choice that no father should ever confront. Between the son of his heart and the son of divine promise. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Abraham knelt in the darkness and wrestled with forces that transcended human understanding. The stars that had once seemed like friendly witnesses to God's faithfulness now felt distant and cold, offering no comfort to a man torn between competing loyalties, conflicting loves, and the mysterious demands of a covenant he had never fully comprehended. "Lord," he whispered, his voice breaking like pottery in drought, "how can I send away the boy? He is my flesh, my blood, the child who learned to walk by holding on to my fingers. You promised to make him into a great nation. Yet now I am asked to cast him into the wilderness with nothing but bread and water. Demand such crar. How can loyalty?" The silence that followed was not empty but pregnant with presence, heavy with the weight of divine purpose that human hearts struggle to bear. When the answer came, it arrived not as comfort but as confirmation impossible of the path that lay ahead. "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." The words should have brought relief, but instead they deepened Abraham's anguish. Divine promise could not erase paternal pain, could not make easy what love made impossible. The God who had called him from who had Leur, teed him through decades of wandering, who had given him a son in his old age, now asked him to trust in ways that defied every instinct of the human heart. In her tent, Hagar felt the approaching storm with the sensitivity of one who had learned to read the subtle signs of household tension. The arrival of Isaac had changed everything, shifting the delicate balance of power that had governed their lives for over a decade, watched Sarah. She has joy in her own child gradually transform into something harder, more possessive, more determined to eliminate any threat to her son's inheritance. The night ban before their nourishment, Hagar held Ishmael close as he slept, memorizing the feel of his breathing against her chest, the weight of his growing body, the trust that radiated from his peaceful features. He was no longer the tiny infant she had received as divine gift, but a young man approaching the threshold of adulthood, strong and intelligent and filled with the wild spirit that marked him as his father's son. "My beloved boy," she whispered into the darkness, "tomorrow we begin a journey I never wanted you to take. You will face trials I cannot shield you from, discover strengths you do not yet know you possess, become someone I can barely imagine. But remember this always: you are not abandoned, you are seen, you are known, you are called by name by the one who shapes the destiny of nations." The child stirred in his sleep, as if some part of his spirit sensed the magnitude of what awaited them. In dreams, perhaps, he was already walking the desert paths that would become his domain, already learning the harsh lessons that would forge his character in ways the comfortable life of Abraham's camp never could. Dawn arrived with the terrible clarity that accompanies moments of irreversible change. Abraham appeared at their tent before the sun had fully risen, his face bearing the marks of a sleepless night spent in communion with powers beyond human understanding. His movements were mechanical, his voice hollow as he pressed into Hagar's hands a skin of water and some bread. Provisions so meager they seemed almost insulting for a journey into the trackless wilderness. But his eyes told a different story. In them, Hagar saw love wrestling with obedience, paternal devotion struggling against divine command, the agony of a man forced to choose between competing claims on his heart. When he placed his hand on Ishmael's shoulder, his fingers trembled with the effort of maintaining composure. "Be strong, my son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Remember that you carry within yourself the promise of nations. God has not forgotten you, and neither will I." Ishmael, still drowsy from sleep and confused by the early hour, looked between his parents with growing awareness that something momentous was happening. The preparations, the tears in his mother's eyes, the strange formality in his father's manner, all combined to create an atmosphere of finality that even his young mind could recognize. "Where are we going, Mother?" he asked, his voice carrying the mixture of excitement and apprehension that characterizes childhood's approach to the unknown. Hagar knelt to his level, taking his face in her hands with a gentleness that belied the strength she would need for what lay ahead. "We are going to discover who you truly are, my son. We are going to learn what it means to depend entirely on the God who hears." The words were more prophetic than she realized. In the wilderness that awaited them, stripped of the familiar structures and comfortable assumptions that had defined their existence, both mother and son would encounter truths about themselves, about divine providence, and about the mysterious ways heaven intersects with human suffering. The wilderness stretched before them like an ocean of stone and sand, vast and merciless beneath the climbing sun. Each step took them further from everything familiar, deeper into a landscape that seemed to mock human frailty with its indifferent beauty. The water skin grew lighter with each passing hour, its contents disappearing drop by precious drop into bodies that demanded more than the meager provisions could provide. Hagar walked with the mechanical determination of one who has no choice but to continue. Behind her, Ishmael matched her pace with the resilience of youth, though she could see the questions growing in his eyes with each mile they traveled. The boy who had grown up surrounded by abundance now faced the harsh reality of scarcity, learning lessons that no amount of comfortable living could teach. The heat became a living thing, pressing down on them with weight that seemed to increase with every breath. Their shadows shortened and disappeared, leaving them exposed to the full fury of a sun that showed no mercy to the desperate. When the water finally ran out, Hagar felt the last thread of hope begin to fray within her chest. They found a patch of scrubby bushes that offered minimal shade. And there Hagar placed her son with hands that trembled not from weakness but from love too deep for expression. Ishmael's breathing had grown labored, his skin hot to the touch, his eyes already holding the distant look that comes when the body begins its final surrender. "Rest here, my beloved," she whispered, her voice cracking like dried earth. "Rest while I look for water." But there was no water to be found, only endless expanse of wilderness that seemed to swallow hope as completely as it swallowed their footprints. Hagar walked away from her son not because she had anywhere to go, but because she could not bear to watch the light fade from his eyes, could not endure witnessing the end of everything she had lived for. She sat at a distance and wept with the abandon of one who has nothing left to lose. The tears that fell were not merely for her son's suffering, but for the promises that seemed to have been lies. The divine words that now felt like cruel mockery in the face of impending death. Where was the great nation that had been foretold? Where was the multiplication beyond counting? Where was the God who was supposed to hear? But in that moment of absolute despair, when human strength had reached its limit and mortal hope had been exhausted, something shifted in the very fabric of reality. The air grew still in a way that had nothing to do with wind, charged with a presence that made the wilderness itself seem to hold its breath. Then came the voice, not to Hagar, though she had been the one to encounter the divine years before at the spring. This time the voice came to Ishmael himself, to the boy who lay beneath the bush with death creeping closer with each labored breath. The voice that called his name carried with it the weight of eternity, the authority of the one who shapes destiny with words. Ishmael, the sound of his own name spoken by heaven itself, penetrated the fog of approaching unconsciousness and reached something deep within the boy's spirit. His eyes opened, not to the harsh glare of the desert sun, but to a vision that transcended physical sight. He saw himself as he truly was, not the rejected son of a servant, not the cast-out child of a divided household, but the chosen bearer of a destiny that would reshape the world. He saw the wilderness not as a place of death, but as a forge where strength was hammered into unbreakable form. He saw his mother's tears not as evidence of abandonment, but as water that would nourish the roots of nations yet unborn. The vision expanded beyond the immediate moment of crisis. Ishmael saw himself growing strong in the trackless wastes, learning skills that palace-raised children would never master. He saw his bow never missing its mark, his arrows finding their targets with supernatural precision. He saw himself gathering followers who valued freedom more than comfort, independence more than security. He saw 12 sons, each destined to become a prince among their people. He saw tribes spreading across the desert like seeds scattered by divine wind, claiming territories that would bear their names through countless generations. He saw caravans crossing endless sands under his descendants' protection, trade routes that would connect distant civilizations flowing through lands his children would guard. But most remarkably, he saw that his rejection had been his selection, his exile his appointment to a role no one else could fill. The wilderness that had seemed like punishment was revealed as preparation, the hardship as education, the abandonment as liberation from limitations that would have constrained his true destiny. As the vision faded, Ishmael felt strength returning to his body, not merely physical vitality, but something deeper. The knowledge that he was not alone, had never been alone, would never be alone. The God who hears had been listening all along, waiting for the moment when human effort had been exhausted so that divine power could be revealed. Hagar, still sitting at her distance of grief, suddenly heard something that made her lift her head in wonder. Not the voice that had spoken to her son, but the sound of water bubbling up from ground that moments before had been bone dry. A well had appeared as if conjured from nothing, its clear depths reflecting sky that seemed brighter than it had moments before. She ran to the water, filled her hands, ran back to Ishmael with life literally flowing between her fingers. As she poured the precious liquid past his lips, she saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. A depth, a knowing, a connection to something beyond the immediate world that surrounded them. "Mother," he said, his voice still weak but carrying new authority. "We are not lost. We are exactly where we need to be." The words carried prophecy in them, though neither fully understood their import at the time. This wilderness would become their kingdom, these harsh conditions their teacher, this apparent abandonment their appointment to a role in history that would outlast empires and survive the rise and fall of countless civilizations. From that well they would build a life that defied every convention of their age. Ishmael would grow into a man who belonged fully neither to the settled world of cities and farms, nor to the purely nomadic existence of wandering tribes. He would become something new, a desert prince who commanded respect through strength rather than inheritance, who led by example rather than decree, who built nations not from conquest but from the voluntary allegiance of those who recognized his unique authority. The echo of this revelation would ripple through time in ways that the dying boy beneath the bush could not possibly foresee. His descendants would establish trade networks that connected continents, create cultures that would influence art and science and philosophy across the known world. They would preserve ancient wisdom through dark ages and carry innovations across vast distances, serving as bridges between civilizations that might otherwise have remained forever separate. But perhaps most significantly, they would embody a principle that the world desperately needed to understand: that divine favor does not always manifest in comfort, that being chosen does not always mean being privileged, that the greatest purposes are sometimes accomplished through the most unlikely instruments. In the wilderness beside a miraculous well, a rejected boy received a revelation that would reshape his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his place in the world. The son who had been cast out discovered that he had been sent forth. The child who had been abandoned learned that he had been appointed. The heir who had been disinherited realized that he had inherited something far greater than lands or flocks or the approval of human society. He had inherited the wild freedom of one who answers directly to heaven, who takes orders from no earthly authority, who builds his life on promises that transcend the temporary concerns of mortal existence. The revelation echoed not just in his own heart, but across the landscape of human possibility, proclaiming that God's purposes are not constrained by human prejudices or limited by conventional expectations. The desert had tested them to the breaking point, but in breaking, they had discovered that they were made of materials stronger than flesh and bone. They were made of faith and fire and the unbreakable conviction that the voice which calls from eternity will never abandon those who answer its summons. The years flowed like sand through an hourglass. each grain marking the transformation of a wilderness exile into a desert patriarch. Ishmael grew tall and strong under the scorching sun, his body adapting to harsh conditions that would have broken those raised in comfort. His skin darkened to leather, his muscles hardened to iron. His eyes developed the far-seeing clarity of one who must read the desert's subtle signs to survive. The miraculous well became the center of a growing community. What began as a place of desperate refuge evolved into an oasis of hope that drew the desperate and the seeking from across the trackless wastes. Merchants whose caravans had wandered off established routes found water and guidance. Tribal leaders facing impossible choices discovered wisdom that came not from books but from the hard-won experience of one who had faced the ultimate test and emerged transformed. Hagar watched her son's development with wonder that never diminished. The boy who had once played in Abraham's camp, constrained by the expectations and limitations of that structured world, had become something unprecedented, a leader who commanded respect through competence rather than birthright, who attracted followers through strength rather than inherited authority. The 12 sons that had been promised began to arrive, each bearing names that would echo through history. Nebaioth, the firstborn, inherited his father's gift for reading the landscape and became master of the northern routes. Kedar developed into a warrior whose reputation for honor in battle attracted the finest fighters from across the desert. Adbeel became known for his wisdom in settling disputes, his tent serving as a court where justice was dispensed with fairness that transcended tribal loyalties. Each son represented not just the expansion of a family, but the birth of a new way of organizing human society. They created confederations rather than kingdoms, alliances rather than empires, networks of mutual obligation that stretched across vast distances without requiring central control. It was governance suited to the desert's demands, flexible, adaptive, resilient in the face of changing conditions. Ishmael's reputation spread beyond the boundaries of the wilderness. Kings in distant cities spoke his name with respect, understanding that the trade routes essential to their prosperity passed through territories controlled by his sons. Diplomatic missions arrived at the oasis seeking treaties and alliances, recognizing that this desert patriarch commanded resources and loyalty that could not be conquered but must be negotiated with. But perhaps most remarkably, Ishmael never forgot the lesson of the well. In a world where power was typically measured by what one could take, he built his influence on what he could give. Water for the thirsty, guidance for the lost, protection for the vulnerable, justice for those who had been wronged by conventional authority. The stories of his fairness became legendary. A merchant cheated by dishonest partners found not just restitution but restoration of his reputation. A young woman fleeing an arranged marriage discovered sanctuary and the freedom to choose her own path. Tribal outcasts who had been rejected by their own people found acceptance in a community that understood the value of those who had been overlooked. As Ishmael aged, his role evolved from active leadership to something deeper, the embodiment of principles that would outlast any individual life. He became a living symbol of the truth that rejection by humans does not constitute abandonment by heaven. That apparent defeat can be the prelude to unprecedented victory, that the wilderness which seems to promise only death can become the birthplace of nations. The final years of his life were marked by a series of remarkable encounters that demonstrated how far his influence had spread. Abraham, now ancient and approaching his own end, made the difficult journey to the oasis. The reunion between father and son carried no bitterness, only the recognition of two men who had walked different paths in service of the same divine purpose. Isaac, too, came to pay his respects, bringing with him an acknowledgement that the brother he had barely known had achieved something extraordinary in the wilderness. The conversation between the half-brothers revealed no rivalry, only mutual understanding that each had played an essential role in a story larger than either could fully comprehend. When Ishmael finally closed his eyes for the last time, he did so knowing that he had fulfilled every promise made beside that long-ago spring. His descendants were indeed too numerous to count, spread across territories that spanned from Egypt to Mesopotamia. They controlled the trade routes that connected civilizations, mediated disputes that might otherwise have led to war, preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to the sands of time. But the true measure of his legacy lay not in numbers or territories or political influence. It lay in the transformation of what it meant to be chosen, to be heard by heaven, to serve divine purposes in a world that often seems deaf to transcendent truth. Ishmael's story became a bridge between different understandings of faith, different approaches to the sacred, different ways of organizing human society. His descendants would carry forward traditions that honored both the settled wisdom of agricultural civilizations and the adaptive intelligence required for life in the margins, in the spaces between established powers. In the centuries that followed, prophets and teachers would invoke his name as evidence that God's attention extends beyond the boundaries of any single community or tradition. The boy who had been heard in the wilderness became proof that divine favor could not be monopolized, that heavenly purposes could not be constrained by human prejudices or limited by conventional expectations. Modern travelers crossing the deserts of the Middle East still encounter wells that bear his name, settlements that trace their origins to his descendants, trade routes that follow paths first established by his caravans. But more importantly, they encounter an enduring testament to the principle that those who seem to have been forgotten are often the very ones chosen for purposes that surpass human understanding. The story of Ishmael speaks across millennia to anyone who has ever felt cast out, overlooked, or abandoned by the very systems that should have provided support and recognition. It whispers hope to the rejected, strength to the exiled, purpose to those who find themselves in wilderness places far from the comfortable certainties of conventional success. In a world that increasingly values conformity over authenticity, security over freedom, inherited privilege over earned respect, Ishmael's legacy offers an alternative vision of human possibility. He demonstrates that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that leadership can be exercised without domination, that influence can be built through service rather than conquest. His name, God Hears, continues to echo wherever voices cry out from the margins, wherever the forgotten seek recognition, wherever those who have been cast aside discover that their exile might actually be their calling to something greater than they ever imagined possible. The desert remembers, the wells still flow. The story continues, and in every generation there are those who hear in Ishmael's ancient cry the sound of their own voice being answered by heaven itself, the promise that no one who calls out in genuine need will ever truly be alone. If this story has touched something deep within your heart, if you've recognized your own journey in Ishmael's wilderness wandering, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your questions, your own experiences of discovering purpose in unexpected places. And if you found meaning in this ancient tale that speaks so powerfully to our modern moment, consider subscribing for more stories that bridge the gap between timeless wisdom and contemporary hope. There's another remarkable journey waiting for you in our next video, another forgotten voice that deserves to be heard.